The Avalon Foundation and MCTV programming is proudly supported by Easton Hardware and Floor Covering. Since 1939, we're still there and we still care.
From what I understand, there are a few teachers here that taught Casey, so a big round of applause for them as well. They did a great job, as you can see. So, just 16 years ago, Casey Sepp was taking final exams over at that school over there on Easton's Mecklenburg Avenue. Having passed those handily, she went to Harvard and received a Bachelor of Arts, and then as a Rhodes Scholar, traveled to Oxford. Not Oxford, Maryland, Oxford, England, where she took a master's degree in theology. As if such academic accomplishments aren't enough, her writings were soon being published in the New Yorker, the New York Times, and the New Republic. And now Casey Sepp's first book, Furious Hours, has debuted at number 6 on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. Time magazine has called it a marvel. NPR has called it gripping, a well-written portrait of not only Harper Lee, but of mid-20th century Alabama. And the book made the cover of the New York Times Book Review. I mean, she's getting wonderful, wonderful reviews. And how many of you have read her book, just so I can see hands? You be encouraged to either purchase a book or we can put you on our holds list. We have a very long list, so that's just really tells you about the kind of writing this book is. So the New York Times Book Review paid Furious Hours the supreme compliment of being not just a superbly written true crime story, but the sort of story that even Harper Lee would have been proud to write. For an author in America today, it doesn't get much better than that. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome, please, for a woman who's done us all proud. Mrs. Casey Sepp.
Thanks so much. It won't surprise you to learn that my mother and father and sister and aunt and some other friends and family of mine are populating the front row, and I wouldn't be surprised to learn that one of them had ghost-written that introduction. It was so warm and generous. It's truly been a pleasure in the last few weeks as the book has been out to really see a lot of the country and do events like this at public libraries around the South and bookstores around the country. And of course, all along I knew that at some point I was going to get to come home. And it's really nice to see all of you. And I know there are people in this room who, my mother delivers your mail, or my father helped you with your groceries, or, we all did your lawn care, or I catered your kid's wedding or graduation party. So you've gotten to know my family, and it's just an honor to be here in this capacity now. And I'm so grateful to the library. They were one of the first places to request an event. So I knew this was coming, and I knew I would have the chance to give thanks actually to, I'm actually hoping if they're not too reticent, my teachers will stand for a minute. So if I had you at, Cordova or Easton, I think there are enough of you who should stand up. It's a really tremendous group, and I would be remiss if I didn't give thanks. First of all, I'm a creature of the public schools and of this public library in particular, and my younger sister actually teaches at Chapel District, the elementary school we came through, and I've been evangelizing for many things on the book tour, and one of them is public education. And I hope that if you're here, you have as much respect for the Talbot County Public Schools as I do. I have a personal debt that I owe them, but I hope that you, especially if you're a taxpayer in this county, are as grateful as I am and take the chance to support them whenever you can, not just in words, but with deeds and, dare I say, taxation. So I'll stop evangelizing, though. It really is an honor to be here, and the truth of the matter is I wouldn't be here if it weren't for an awfully strange evangelist, one who, if you've read the book, you've had a chance to meet him, and that's the Reverend Willie Maxwell. And a lot of people who read this book read it for Harper Lee, and that's a fine reason to read it. She's truly a third of the book, and she's how I came to know this story, and her story is a big part of it. But if you're only in it for Harper Lee, I'd ask you to be patient, because she really only turns up. She's there in the first few pages, and then she, as she was wont to do, disappears for 2/3 of the book, and she shows up again at the end. And that's because I wanted you to know something about this true crime story that she was hoping to turn into her second book after Mockingbird. And that crime story involves a Baptist minister in a small town in Alabama who was accused of killing several of his family members for the insurance money. And so his story forms the first third of the book. And when I do events like this, I like to read a little from each of the 3 sections. And so I'll start with the Reverend Maxwell, and then I'll tell you a little bit about his attorney. And then finally, if you're here for Harper Lee, be patient. Just as in the book, she will turn up in the reading, but just a few minutes from now. So I'll read for just a tiny bit of time, and a tiny bit from each section, and then I'm happy to take questions, and then I'll stay until the cows come home to get every book signed you want, because I know there are some of you who've already said, you've already read it and you bought it and you brought it with you, or you bought it tonight, and I'll make sure that we have time for questions and a signing as well. So thanks so much for coming, and sit back, enjoy the air conditioning. I'm about to take you back to 1970s Alabama, and I can tell you from all the reporting and research I did down there, it's awfully hot. And if you think you know a hot summer's day on the eastern shore of Maryland, you don't know a hot summer's day until you go to the deep south. And so this first bit from the Reverend Maxwell section is in 1972, and I like to read this passage because it gives you a sense of, it's one thing to look at any kind of historical event in hindsight, it's another to imagine living through it. And I like to read this passage because at this point, one of the Reverend's wives, and he ended up having several wives, but the first of his wives has been found murdered, and he was tried for her murder, although surprisingly acquitted. The police thought they had an open and shut case, and it turned out that their star witness changed her testimony. And it was inexplicable to them until a few months after the trial, she became the second Mrs. Maxwell. So the woman who was supposed to testify against him instead provided an alibi, and then she became the second Mrs. Maxwell. And that marriage was only possible because her husband, too, died under suspicious circumstances. And so for the people around this part of Alabama, all of these events have so far unfolded between 1970 and 1972, they started to wonder about how it was the Reverend Willie Maxwell seemed to get whatever he wanted. And they came up with, depending on what you think about superstition or religion, they came up with what they thought was a pretty good explanation for why. And if you haven't read the book, you'll figure it out in the first clause of this. But it's 1972, and one of the Reverend's wives has been found murdered. A neighbor has turned up dead under suspicious circumstances, and he's just remarried this other neighbor of his. Whether or not the Reverend Willie Maxwell was actually a voodoo priest, he lived in a community willing to believe that he was. Plenty of good Christians in Coosa County shook out their pillows at night and scrubbed their steps in the morning to fend off spirits and spells, warned their children that the hoodoo man would get them if they stayed out too late, and told their spouses that they would lay a trick on them if they did not stop drinking or lying about drinking. Coincidence just wasn't a word that rolled off tongues in Alabama as easily as conjuring. So when the Reverend Willie Maxwell was acquitted of murdering his first wife and remarried the much younger widow of his conveniently deceased neighbor, a lot of people were convinced that he had used voodoo to fix the jury, put death on his neighbor's trail, and charm a much younger woman. Maybe the Reverend Maxwell had burned a court case candle or used law stay-away oil. Perhaps he had nailed a photograph of his neighbor to the north-facing side of a tree and added another nail every morning for 9 mornings until the man weakened and died. As for the much younger, much prettier neighbor, well, he might have sprinkled wishing oil on a sample of her handwriting, worn it for 9 days by his heart, and then buried it under his front steps. However unlikely such theories might seem, they were more comforting than the alternative. For many of the Reverend's neighbors, it was better to believe that in the face of conjuring, there was nothing that law enforcement and the judicial system could do than to believe that in the face of such terrible crimes, they had not done enough. Supernatural explanations flourish wherever law and order fails, which is why as time passed and more people died, the stories about the Reverend Maxwell grew stronger, stranger, and if possible, more sinister. The most widespread one began like a fairy tale with 7 sisters and 7 brothers. Willie Maxwell, people said, was the 7th son of a 7th son, a numerological curiosity that meant he had been born with power over life and death. To augment this natural gift, he supposedly went down to New Orleans to study voodoo with the 7 sisters, a fearsome septet well known throughout the South. Although their history and even their existence are disputed, stories about the sisters have circulated since the 1920s. They were said to be clairvoyant, ageless, and available to sell their blessings, curses, candles, and potions to anyone who came calling at their 7 identical dwellings on Coliseum Street in the Garden District. Have any of you all ever been to New Orleans? Did you walk down Coliseum Street? Do you remember the 7 sisters' houses? I couldn't justify the research expense of going down there. It became very clear, and you'll learn about this in a minute. There's no evidence that the Reverend actually went to New Orleans, so even though I was down in Alabama doing all this reporting, I didn't go down, but I just did a book event in New Orleans, and the bookshop sent me down Coliseum Street to see the houses, which indeed you can go and do, and they're architecturally interesting, and it's obvious why people started to tell stories like this about those houses, but none of what follows happened to me and probably won't happen to you if you do take a trip to New Orleans. Out-of-state license plates were always pulling up there, and people came and went at all hours of the day and night. Some of the visitors were just customers, but others were disciples, including supposedly one lean, elegant, well-dressed man from Coosa County, Alabama. Never mind for a minute that the Reverend Willie Maxwell actually just had 4 brothers, plus 4 numerologically inconvenient sisters. The rumors about him grew taller than the loblolly pines around Lake Martin. He hung white chickens upside down from the pecan trees outside his house to keep away unwanted spirits. He painted blood on his doorsteps to keep away the authorities. He carried envelopes filled with deadly powders. He had a whole room at home just for voodoo, lined with jars labeled love, hate, friendship, and death. If he got sick, he drank someone else's blood to feel better. Drive by his front door and the headlights of your car would go dark. Say a cross word against him and he would lay a trick on you. Look him in the eye and he would curse you forever. He could move faster than was humanly possible, traveling the 150 miles from Birmingham to Atlanta in 20 minutes. If he needed to vanish quicker than that, he could turn into a black cat. And I like to read that, first of all, just to give you a sense of, again, as the terror and fear grew around this part of Alabama, people were reaching for explanations, but I also feel the need to warn you, lest you think that those were the kinds of stories told to the nice girl from the Eastern Shore of Maryland who came to investigate this case. One of my favorite facts I learned about Harper Lee's attempt to write about this was when she moved to this town and she started working on her own book about the Reverend Maxwell, she adopted a stray black cat, which she called the Reverend Maxwell. So already people were telling these kinds of stories about this case, and people were, linking things they had heard about rumor or superstition or voodoo together in an effort to kind of explain what was happening. And, for Harper Lee, it must have seemed all very interesting because, of course, when you think about that paragraph I just read of the sorts of things that people said about the Reverend Maxwell, it's not so unlike the kinds of things they said about Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird, and the sort of things that probably you've said about someone in St. Michael's or Easton or Cordova or Trapp. You pick a town and we all have these kinds of bogeymen and we have different explanations for them, and I think it is one of the things that really drew her to this case. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Reverend was a practitioner of voodoo, and yet there are still people today in Coosa County you can't convince that he wasn't, because otherwise there is no way to understand what happened. And what happened is, I just read you that passage from 1972, but after that, the second Mrs. Maxwell was found dead under similar circumstances. A nephew of the Reverend's, a brother of the Reverend's, a stepdaughter of the Reverend's, all of these people continued to die, and he held these large life insurance policies on them. And so, not surprisingly, people thought they had a motive. They thought they knew who did it, and they just needed to be able to explain why the police couldn't stop it or hold him responsible. So for the first third of the book, there's this kind of, mounting suspense and suspicion about what will happen to the Reverend and who will stop him. And some of that fear and terror kind of mounted because, aside from the voodoo business, the Reverend actually had a very good attorney. And the same attorney represented him for almost a decade. And that was in everything from, mortgage deeds transactions to all of these criminal investigations to a large number of civil suits where the Reverend, at a certain point, these life insurance companies caught on to this business and they tried to stop payment. Just the way they would deny a policy to you if you had, fabricated your application process, or it turned out, you had misrepresented the nature of your relationship to the person insured. These companies started to say no, and so the Reverend then had an attorney who would take them to court, and whatever, local circuit court or the district court, or some of these cases went all the way to the state court of appeals, or they were large enough policies that they were immediately on the federal docket. And over and over and over again, this very talented lawyer managed to get the Reverend all of this insurance money, and it amounted to at least $500,000 in today's dollars. And people knew this, right? He was buying nicer cars, he was buying nicer clothes. It was very conspicuous. Aside from the deaths, his kind of financial benefit from these crimes was conspicuous. And that same lawyer was already kind of well known in this part of Alabama because he was a Kennedy liberal in the Wallace years. So he was a Democrat who was pro-integration, and he was a Democrat who was pro-public education, and pro everything most people in Alabama were against. And he'd served in the state legislature, but then he ran for lieutenant governor, and that effort was thwarted. And so he was kind of well known for these lost causes and these hard cases. And so not surprisingly, he was the guy who represented the Reverend. That was until, at the funeral of the Reverend's last victim, the Reverend was gunned down by a vigilante. He was shot 3 times in the head in front of 300 people at the funeral of his stepdaughter. And it wasn't surprising to people around Lake Martin that the man who shot the Reverend wanted a lawyer, but it surprised them when he decided to use the same lawyer who had represented the Reverend for a decade. And so Tom Radney, the lawyer who had represented the Reverend in all of these civil and criminal cases, then took the case of the vigilante who had murdered his former client. And that elicited a lot of commentary too. And Tom, who was, the kind of guy who you certainly wanted as your lawyer, but whose politics and whose legal ethics had often raised eyebrows around town, was suddenly, faced with a bit of a predicament. He did not want to lose, but he had taken the case of someone who had shot a man 3 times in cold blood in front of 300 people. And so the part of the book I like to read, and I hope you'll be patient with Tom, he's one of my favorite characters in the book, and he's a very interesting figure, and if you've ever thought about what it would be like to be at odds with your kind of family of origin or your community of origin, he's a good test case. And his kind of political reception in Alabama is not dissimilar from the ones that some people are getting around the country today, and the kind of debates over civility and how we relate to people who have different political opinions was very much alive for Tom, and particularly in the late 60s. He, at the 68 convention, when kind of everybody else from the South wanted Wallace to run, and indeed George Wallace mounted a third-party campaign and he actually managed to get a lot of votes for a third-party candidate, Tom nominated Teddy Kennedy and wanted him to run for president on the Democratic slate. So that interview had aired on national TV, and Tom's family was threatened and menaced, and there's a bit in the book just about that political situation, and I think it's truly one of the most kind of contemporary bits of the book, and I hope you'll be patient with him because it's part of the reason you can understand this man with tremendous ambition and idealism settles into small town law, and he lives for trial cases like this. The longer the odds, the better the case for him. And the greater the opportunity to distinguish himself, the happier he is. And so here he is in the summer of 77, which again is just too climate controlled in this room for you to imagine the summer of 77. And I'm about to tell you how hot it was down in this part of Alabama, but Tom Radney takes this case. The Reverend is gunned down in June of 1977. And he's got this new client, and he's trying to figure out what on earth he's going to do. So what you heard a few minutes ago was 72. So by 77, the Reverend's lost 2 wives, a brother, a nephew, a stepdaughter, possibly a neighbor. And he's just been murdered. And so Tom's figuring out, he knows well how he defended the Reverend, but he's figuring out what to do about this new case, the case of the vigilante. In the weeks after the Reverend Maxwell's funeral, the temperature in Alexander City barely fell below 100 degrees. June's hot spell turned to July's heat wave. The hayfields that generally had 2 cuttings by midsummer hadn't yet had 1. Cotton was a third of its usual height. The corn had dried up entirely, and most of the soybean crop hadn't even been sown. You can imagine the knowledge that an audience in Manhattan brings to that. You guys know what all of that means. Sometimes in some of these very urban readings. You sort of look around and think, do people know what it looks like if soybeans don't get enough rain? But you guys are well acquainted, even if you can't imagine, 117-degree heat indices, you can imagine what it's like when your crops don't grow. Dust devils swirled around the sides of the highways. The sun rose up every morning into an already smoldering day, scorched everything beneath it, and set into a stifling night. Clouds occasionally formed and threatened, but the rains never came. By the third week of July, the drought was so severe that President Jimmy Carter declared both Coosa County and Tallapoosa County, not to mention the rest of Alabama and Georgia, disaster areas. The heat that summer made the farmers crazy, made the loggers crazy, made the mill workers crazy, made basically everyone in town crazy except for the Iceman and the kids down in Lake Martin, which is how one day Big Tom Radney settled on his defense of Robert Burns. In the middle of July, when Burns was indicted by a grand jury, he did as Radney told him and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Insanity isn't an easy thing to prove, and it is often the defense of last resort. The belief that madness can be exculpatory is an ancient one, so ancient that it was carved into the Code of Hammurabi 1700 years before the birth of Christ, alongside the notion of proportional retaliation, lex talionis, an eye for an eye. But by the time Tom Radney invoked it, the insanity defense had been out of favor for a century. Queen Victoria had tried stifling it out of fear that it was encouraging would-be assassins. 100 years later, President Richard Nixon had the same idea. Too many defendants had turned out to be insane only until acquittal, and prosecutors and psychiatrists alike had come to worry that the defense was just a way of letting murderers get away with murder. Around the country, there were examples of defendants sent to state mental hospitals after a jury had decided they were insane, only to have the hospital staff release them after diagnosing them as sane. In response, some states, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, and Utah, had banned the insanity plea entirely, but Alabama still allowed it. And Big Tom Radney decided it was his best bet. In reality, it was probably his only bet. His client had brought a pistol into a chapel, shot a man 3 times in front of hundreds of people, and then confessed to the police not once, but twice. A first-year law student could have successfully prosecuted the case in his sleep. But Tom's opposing counsel in the murder trial of Robert Burns was not a first-year law student, to put it mildly. By the time the trial started, Thomas F. Young had already served 16 years as district attorney, and he was just starting another 6-year term. He too went by Tom, and he was said to have tried more criminal cases than any other DA in Alabama history. He and Tom Radney had faced off in 50 or so other murder trials, and although both men had respected records, they had very different styles. Radney is silk and Young is sandpaper, Alvin Benn wrote in the local newspaper, the Alexander City Outlook. Ben was a man well acquainted with contrasts. A Jewish reporter raised in Pennsylvania Amish country, he'd gone south to cover the civil rights movement and stayed to raise a family, listening nervously once as KKK members denounced Zionist Jews at a rally, but then invited him out drinking afterward. He had interviewed the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the police commissioner Bull Connor once for the same story. But even Alvin Benn had seldom seen 2 men diverge as dramatically as the 2 Toms. Tom Young wasn't about to lose a murder case when he had hundreds of witnesses, and Tom Radney wasn't about to lose a case with the whole state watching. Despite what pot boilers and Perry Mason would lead you to believe, Alvin wrote in his editorial, most trials resemble warmed over grits, and it takes some doing to stay awake. But the Robert Burns case was bound to be different. And it was, in terms of giving you a sense of how the book works, if you haven't read it, what follows is basically a kind of TikTok, a John Grisham-like account of that trial, because it's wildly interesting. And I think it's, to my mind, one of the most dynamic moments in the book to sort of imagine yourself into the past and think about what you might have done, because the moral stakes are quite high. The district attorney is making arguments about law and order and who is subject to the law and whether vigilantism is a safety mechanism or a menace to the community. And Tom Radney is making a series of overt arguments about who Robert Burns is and his mental condition, but a lot of subtextual arguments about the public service he provided the community. And I think it's one of those cases where truly you try and imagine yourself onto the jury and think about what you would have done. And I won't spoil it if you haven't read the book, because of course the other reason this trial in this small town in the middle of Nowheresville, Alabama was significant was because Harper Lee was there. And Harper Lee, who finally, if you're in it for Harper Lee, here she is, get ready, put your hearing aids back in. I've gotten through the boring business of the Reverend Maxwell and Tom Radney, which I assure you, are plenty of readers who just look at me and say, you haven't convinced me, like I just am in it for Harper Lee. But I think of the book as a kind of democratic book. It takes seriously the potential subjects of a novelist, not just the novelist herself. So I think that every life is worthy of study and attention, not just the ones that are already famous. So that's my sales pitch for why you shouldn't just skip ahead to the last third of the book. But if you do skip ahead, just go back and read the first 2/3, because you'll have a greater understanding of what Harper Lee was up against. And I like to read this passage from, it's a whole chapter, if you can believe it. I know I've been reading for a long time, and I told you it would be short, but it's the shortest chapter in the book. There's a first Harper Lee chapter, and it's called Disappearing Act, which if you listen closely at the end, you'll know why. But it's this chapter I like to read because a lot of times I get asked about how I wrote this book. And I think there are a lot of authors who will take a lot of credit and basically tell you about the voodoo hexes they come up with to like wrestle prose and come up with beautiful stories. And the truth is, when you're doing reporting, sometimes you just get really lucky. And there's a photograph in the book, if you have it in front of you, of a check that Harper Lee wrote the court reporter. That was a lucky day. I had been told that woman was dead, and then I found her, and then in the middle of our conversation she says, I haven't talked about all this since I talked to Harper Lee about it. She says, do you want to see the check she wrote me? Because I was like, wait, what? And I yeah, I want to see the check. And there it is. And, it's pure luck. And this first chapter is another kind of luck, which is, the right thing happens to the right narrator. And as a reporter, you're lucky to meet someone who can narrate their own experience in a way that's instantly compelling. And this chapter is about a woman named Marion Pittman Allen, who I had been told had interacted with Harper Lee, and I did what I often do in these cases. I wrote her a long letter, with my, bona fides and my publisher's information and an attempt to seem legitimate enough to, respond to. And I typed up all of my questions, and I, did all this in like size 42 font because she was 91 years old. And I thought, all right, here we go. The Hail Mary goes in the mail. And I got a phone call back a couple days later at midnight. Which again, 91-year-old woman calls me at midnight and wants to tell me this story of when she talked to Harper Lee. And she did it so forcefully, she just wrote herself into the book. And again, you're just lucky when I barely called her. And I'm telling you all this partly too because there are 2 curse words in what I'm about to read, and if you're offended by profanity, they came directly from Marion Pittman Allen, who was 91 and has subsequently died, so you can't be mad about it because she's too dead to care what you think of her use of profanity. But I myself want to apologize because having been, born and raised here and taught my sirs and ma'ams and please and thank yous, I know that obviously some people are offended by profanity. So the first one comes early, and the second one, you'll be so at ease in Marion Pittman Allen's voice, you'll just forgive me for reading it. So here we go. It was the damnedest thing, but Marion Pittman Allen couldn't find a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird anywhere in Washington. Mrs. James Browning Allen was the second wife of the junior senator from the great state of Alabama, and in that role she was expected not only to attend the ladies of the Senate luncheon, but to present the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter, with a book representative of her home state. It was obvious to Allen which book she should bring, since there was no Alabama tale more famous than the one about the adventures of a tomboy named Scout and her heroic lawyer of a father, Atticus Finch. But even though there were millions of copies of Nell Harper Lee's novel in circulation at the time, Allen couldn't find a single one for sale in the nation's capital. Allen was Lee's age, and they had both dropped out of the University of Alabama around the same time. Lee had been a student at the law school and quit to write. Allen had been a journalism student and quit to have children. Her first marriage didn't take, and she had 3 mouths to feed, so she began working as a reporter for a handful of newspapers around Birmingham. That's how she met her second husband, who was then Lieutenant Governor James Browning Allen, a widower with 2 children of his own. She heard church bells on her way to interview him for a story and prayed it wasn't a sign, but 4 months later they were married, and 4 years after that they were moving to Washington for him to take his seat in the United States Senate. Allen didn't like to make a big production out of her role as a lady of the Senate, but she also didn't want to embarrass her husband or her home state, so she was determined to bring the right gift to Mrs. Carter. When she couldn't find the book, she went looking for its author. Alan knew that she and Lee had a mutual friend from their Tuscaloosa days, and she thought that he might know how to get a hold of her. Nearly everyone in the state would have recognized John Forney's voice, and the half who were Alabama fans basically thought it was the voice of God. I'm amazed you all are laughing. It's like the only time that joke gets a laugh outside of the state of Alabama. I'm wondering if I have like Alabamians in the audience. John Forney had been calling, maybe you just read the book that closely, my goodness. Everybody got the same quality education I did at Easton High School. You're such close readers, you retain the memory that John Forney had been calling the play-by-play for the Crimson Tide for over a decade. So that joke also only plays well on the Bama side of Alabama. Like if you read it over in Auburn, they just turn their nose up at it and say, War Eagle and march out. John, Alan said when the sportscaster answered, "Do you know where Nell Lee is? I've simply got to find a copy of her book." After she explained why, Forney told her that Lee was in Alexander City. Alan knew Alex City well. Her first husband had been born and raised there. In the years when her own father was building levees on the Mississippi River and living with her mother in a tent on its banks, her ex-father-in-law had been hobnobbing in the Alabama State Senate. After that, J. Sanford Mullins had gone to Alex City to serve more than 3 decades as the town's attorney. As best as Alan could remember, the most exciting thing that had ever happened around Lake Martin was her ex-father-in-law climbing into the bed of a pickup truck to deliver a speech. Unfailingly fiery numbers that could draw an audience from 3 counties. But the oratorical wizard of Channahatchee Creek had long since died, and she couldn't imagine what would entice a world-famous author to Tallapoosa County. What in the world, Alan asked Forney incredulously, is she doing in Alex City? Lee was there writing, Forney said, but if Alan could give him a little time, he would try and get a hold of her. A few hours later, Forney called back and said that he had tracked Lee down at the Horseshoe Bend Motel. Maybe she knew it. It was that hexagon-shaped number out on Highway 280. He had been given the go-ahead to give her the writer's private telephone number. It was like she was hiding behind damn trees down there, Alan remembers. But I got the secret number and we talked for over an hour. They talked about small-town lawyers, since Alan wondered if Lee knew anything about her ex-father-in-law, and they talked about journalism, since Lee was a regular reader of Alan's syndicated column, Reflections of a News Hen. When Alan finally got around to asking why Lee was hanging her hat in Alex City, the author wouldn't say much, just that she had been there for a few months, working on something that had to do with a voodoo preacher. Lee did say, though, that she would make sure a copy of her novel got to the nation's capital by May 15, 1978, in time for the luncheon. True to her word, Lee sent a signed first edition of her book, inscribed on the front page to Rosalind Carter. I should say this is a beautiful inscription, and it's criminal that I read it because all of you are going to expect something so wonderfully articulate. But I will remind you, Lee got to sit in her hotel room and dream up this perfect inscription. It had a verse from one of the hymns to wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Mrs. Allen presented the book to Mrs. Carter at the Ladies of the Senate luncheon, which, as it happens, was the last one of those Allen would ever attend. 2 weeks later, after she and her husband had returned to Alabama for the summer recess, Senator James Browning Allen died of a heart attack. Not long after that, Governor George Wallace appointed Marion Pittman Allen to her husband's seat, making her the state's 2nd female senator. Overwhelmed both personally and professionally, she forgot all about the Pulitzer Prize winner holed up at the Horseshoe Bend Motel. It was easy enough to forget about Harper Lee in those days. To Kill a Mockingbird had come out 18 years before, and in all that time, Lee had published almost nothing else. 3 short essays for 2 glossy magazines, 2 tiny profiles that were favors for her friend Truman Capote, 1 satirical recipe for cracklin bread in a novelty cookbook. In nearly 2 decades, that was the only writing she had put into the world. No second novel had followed the first, and she hadn't given an interview in 14 years. The last time she had so much as agreed to be quoted in print was another favor for Capote. In 1976, he had asked Lee to sit with him during an interview for People magazine. She had said a total of 12 words on the record, 7 of which were, "We are bound by a common anguish." To Kill a Mockingbird had made Harper Lee extravagantly wealthy, but you wouldn't have known it to look around her life. When she was in New York, she lived in a small rent-controlled apartment on the Upper East Side. When she went home to Alabama, she stayed with one of her sisters in a modest brick ranch house in their hometown of Monroeville. No matter where she was, she avoided the press, her fans, and anything that seemed too literary. She tried to live her life as if she had never published one of the most popular novels in American history. In 1962, the year the film adaptation of her book came out, the one that earned Gregory Peck an Oscar and further fixed her portrait of a small southern town in the nation's collective memory, Harper Lee had told a reporter for the Mobile Register that she wanted to disappear, and she basically had. But now, alone in a motel in the middle of nowhere, with the world no longer watching, she was nearly free as she had been in the tiny flat where she had written To Kill a Mockingbird. That was what she chose not to tell Marianne Pittman Allen that day on the telephone. Harper Lee was in Alexander City because finally, all these years later, she was going to write another book. Before you clap, I like to say, dun dun dun. So, that's what I like to read from Harper Lee, and I'm obviously the book then gets into her life and who she was as a writer and what drew her to this case and what made it hard for her to write this book and some others that she attempted as well. And so I'm happy to take questions about her, about the case in Alabama, about how wonderful my parents are. I would ask you not ask anything too hard because you'll embarrass me in front of them and all of my high school and elementary school teachers, so keep them easy. Softball is preferred, but I'm happy to take as many questions as we have time for. Yes, ma'am.
I was really impressed with how you made what I thought was mundane fascinating. To learn about the history of life insurance.
It's okay to laugh and or cringe. I kept that from you in my, synopsis of what happens in this book, but yeah. That's very kind of you to say.
And that to me, the book read like that all the way through. You taught me about, I'm a trial attorney, you taught me things about my profession that I didn't know.
It's not a how-to guide for insurance fraud or trial lawyers. These things are done very differently today. The standards for executing policies and trying cases, and I'm sure you would never get away with that in Talbot County.
The way you made it relevant for today, people look for legal and times and things are incomprehensible.
Sure.
They never even understand. I mean, you were speaking about today as well. So thank you for that.
Sure.
How long you researched a long time. How long did it take you to write the book?
Sure. I'll spare you repeating every one of those compliments, although I'll cherish every one of them. The question is, how long did it take? And so the story of how this book came to be is probably not surprisingly. I know Miss Ford right here remembers, I, as a child, looked exactly like Mary Badham, the actress who played Scout in the movie. And I loved To Kill a Mockingbird as a kid, and my parents indulged my love of that novel by getting me a pocket watch. So if you've read the dedication, it's true that in the way that parents should when their children are interested in something, they fed that interest. But they never took me to Alabama. They never took me to see where Harper Lee was from. And so in 2015, you might remember that Go Set a Watchman, the second book by Harper Lee, was announced, and I went down for the New Yorker to report on that because it was this manuscript where there were questions about the provenance. Had she actually written it? There were questions about her mental state. Was she able to consent to publication? Did she want this book in the world? And I went down to report that story, and while I was there, I learned about the Maxwell case. And I wrote a quick story for the New Yorker about this true crime project, the last line of which is, I had interviewed the Tom Radney, the lawyer's family, and the last line of that piece said, "The Radney family is sanguine. If Harper Lee didn't write this book, someone else will." And of course, at that moment, I was like, why not me? This is a great idea for a book. And more information turned up, and some people who had lived through this story emerged. And so I started the reporting in March of 2015. And it's still, if you've read the book, there's this kind of sweet moment where Harper Lee has finished To Kill a Mockingbird, and she has a few months between when the page proofs are due and when it gets published. There's still that same delay in publishing, so I actually had to put the book to bed quite a few months ago before it came out. And they do things like the cover, and they print the photos, and the copy editors get to work, and the designers and that sort of thing. So I had to put it to bed a little sooner than May. I didn't do anything nearly as productive as go help a friend, report in cold blood. That's what she got up to when she, it was incredible, the time between when she had submitted the manuscript of Mockingbird and before it was published, she went out to Kansas with Capote to do the reporting that became In Cold Blood. So I didn't do anything quite that productive. I mostly just twiddled my thumbs and nervously waited and wondered what would happen with this book, and hung out with my family. But yeah, so I started it in 2015. And I'm quite lucky. This is a book that's made from a lot of other books. And so with something like the history of life insurance, it's incredibly fascinating. If you can believe it, I would say that I had to summarize hundreds of pages of very interesting research, and not just historical research, but there's actually been a lot of good restorative justice work around. The plot of this book is about the Reverend's kind of exploitation of a financial market. So he takes out these policies and he profits from them. But it's true that the fraud and predation worked in the other direction too. So a lot of these companies were refusing to insure Black lives, or they were charging more money for the policies, or they were denying payment when a Black individual died, refusing to pay out to the families. So it's actually a tremendous amount of work that's gone on to kind of get settlements for those families, and there were just a couple of large, hundreds of billions of dollars of payouts in the last few years from some of the big AIG, these large companies. And so if you can believe it, some people think there's too much insurance in this book. I think there's not enough. And you should go and read, 10 other books on life insurance, but it's worth it if you're trepidatious. Again, if you're hearing this thinking this is not the book for me, it's 4 pages. You can skip over it, but you'll miss out on the Lisbon earthquake and the Great Fire of London and all sorts of wonderfully interesting bits of history. And in particular, there the hortatory names are sort of, I think, worth the price of admission. But I would never have imagined it would be quite so divisive. It seems essential to me that you understand how someone could exploit the market in order to understand the Reverend's kind of purported motive for committing these crimes. But it's far less controversial than, I basically give you a genre summary of true crime, all the way back to the Gospels, and nobody ever complains about that. They always just bring up the life insurance. So it's 4 pages. You can skip it if it's not your thing. Yes?
Actually, just to key upon the last comment you made, the issue with respect to public policy and insurable interest was just the subject of a decision by the New Jersey Supreme Court in the last 2 months. So it continues to be heavily litigated.
So I'll just explain one quick thing. So insurable interest has to do with who you are allowed to take out an insurance policy on. So it used to be that you didn't have to prove that you had any relationship to the individual, which amounted to you had no reason to want them to stay alive, which is why so many of these policies turned out to be motive for murder. Nowadays you have to explain, first of all, you have to have the person's social security number, they have to consent to be insured, and you have to demonstrate that you have an insurable interest in keeping them alive. But it's a standard that evolved. It was not originally part of what was required to execute a policy.
But my question is this. I was curious about the opening paragraph of your book, in which you say, men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Excuse me, that's one of the opening paragraphs of the Mockingbird, which was given prominence by Horton in the screenplays. And in your opening paragraph, it's while men's suits were damp under the lawn of a regular college. I was wondering if that was an intentional parallel, since you were paying homage, or whether you were just commenting on the weather.
Both. I think that a lot of what's so wonderful about Mockingbird, and the reason people around Alabama and in the Deep South love that novel, even though it's kind of critical and abrasive and a little like sandpaper with a lot of their ways of living, it's just so accurate and realistic, and it's built from those kinds of details. So it's certainly the case that my first few days in Monroeville, my collar wilted. I showed up with these pressed shirts because I always try and look professional when I'm door knocking on strangers' doors, and so it's both true and there's a lot of that in the novel, that kind of observed life, and there's a lot of homages in my book. I mean, I probably read To Kill a Mockingbird, a dozen times just when I was working on the book, and I had read it 3 times as many times as that as a child. So it's a book that really kind of saturated my voice as a writer and my eyes as a reporter. And then it was awfully fun with this book to kind of have a reason to pay that kind of homage to it. So you'll see it there in the beginning, and certainly when you get into Harper Lee's section, it's also the case that I had to borrow from her this wonderful account of Truman Capote's name. Does anybody know what Truman Capote's actual name was? Well, he's Dill in the novel, good memory. But he's got a longer name in the novel too, but Truman Capote was actually Truman Streckfus Person's Capote, and then his mother remarried, so he got the Capote. But Harper Lee says this wonderful thing about Dill, that his name was twice as tall as he was. And you just can't help but borrow it when you're trying to talk about the oddity of a child like Truman Capote. And so there's a lot of that, and I borrow some too from In Cold Blood. So the other book that my book is really in conversation with is In Cold Blood. I told you that in this interim of time in her life, she went and helped Capote report it. And as best I can tell, it's really the model she had in mind for this book she was calling The Reverend. And I think that because there are identical notes that she took when she was out in Kansas and when she was in Alabama, but a less obvious homage. But I think that for me, one that was more important is my book ends at the graves of the three main characters, so I don't want to spoil it for you. The Reverend has not come back from the dead. He's dead. Tom Radney died before I started this book, and Harper Lee died in the middle of my reporting it. And so the very end of the book takes you around to the cemeteries where they're buried. And if you've read In Cold Blood recently, you know that that's where In Cold Blood ends. But quite scandalously, In Cold Blood ends with a scene that never happened. Capote invented it for dramatic effect, and it's beautifully written, and it is quite emotional and evocative. But I chose to end my book in a similar way, but in a very deliberately, more factual way, because one of Harper Lee's deep objections to In Cold Blood were the inaccuracies, and were the liberties that Capote took in order to make the book sound better and have a kind of more coherent aesthetic. And she was greatly troubled by those things, and it's part of what she hoped to correct in her book. And it's part of the reason she imagined a different kind of true crime reporting. So I think even though you end up in this sort of boring driving tour of Alabama, you're just in the car with me as I take you around to these places. It's better than pretending it's some other way. I don't, for instance, have Harper Lee go visit the Reverend's grave. I suspect she did it while she was in town, but no one could tell me for sure she had. And I suspect that, Tom Radney took people to the Reverend's grave, but no one ever could tell me for sure he had. And so rather than invent something, you get what is a little unsatisfying, which really is me taking you through these places in the present day. But it felt important to come back to this problem with In Cold Blood and the temptations of this kind of narrative nonfiction where you can always write something that's better. I could have told you there was some guy who was so hot that he took his shirt off in the Robert Burns trial, but of course he didn't. People were well acquainted with the heat. Their collars wilted, but they went home and changed their shirts. So yes, there are a lot of those. If you go looking, I've had a couple of teachers who teach Mockingbird sort of try and count them up. And there are a number of them, and I'm sure even beyond the number I know there are some unconscious ones, because like any kind of good writing, it seeps into you. And I think for Harper Lee, one of the real joys of reading, I got to read hundreds of her letters to write this book, and she was absolutely steeped in the King James Bible. And every so often it was as if she didn't even know what she was doing. She would be quoting a psalm, or, I told you she quotes from Proverbs there in that inscription to Mrs. Carter. So we all have these kinds of texts that sort of shape us in a way that you don't even know you're paying homage to them. And I was lucky my first book got to be about a book that meant so much to me. But again, back to the beginning of that, life insurance has changed. Don't try any of this at home. Yes, ma'am.
The comment was that leads into what I was going to ask you, and that is your theology studies. I was very curious as to how that, if it did, lead you into your current investigative reporting, and also, like you just recently you were just quoting, from Harper Lee from the Bible.
Sure.
Does any of that study influence you?
Sure.
In your investigative report?
I don't think an investigative reporter would have titled a chapter "Divide the Waters from the Waters" if he didn't love the Bible and didn't think a lot about cosmologies that come from Scripture. But the other kind of constituency I'm looking around, and there are probably just as many public school graduates in the room as Lutherans. And I grew up in the Lutheran church at St. Paul's Lutheran in Cordova, and our sister parish is Grace here in Easton. And I grew up in the church, and it is how I learned to read and think about texts. I love to say it sort of surprises people, but the first book club I was ever in was church. And we met once a week to very seriously talk about the same book. It happened to be the same book over and over again, but you talk about parable and metaphor and allegory, and textual criticism is what the pastor is engaged in every week if you're lucky and you have a talented preacher. And actually thought for a while that I wanted to be a minister in the Lutheran Church, and veered back to writing after theological studies, and it's certainly the case it informs my interest in stories. The Reverend Maxwell was immediately interesting to me, and the degree to which a minister can, I think the shallow word for what the Reverend Maxwell was a hypocrite. The more interesting question is, the degree to which his convictions were sincere or known even unto him. And it's certainly the case. I've interviewed people who had a kind of charismatic experience with him preaching. He was very well regarded for his preaching. It's part of the reason the kind of rumors around the murders could persist for as long as they did. There were so many people who felt deeply convicted that he was a minister of God, and a preacher of the gospel, and he was very eloquent in his ability to quote scripture and to preach extemporaneously, and so that was immediately interesting to me. And I think one of the most underappreciated aspects of Harper Lee's writing, and of some other Southern novelists too, is their relationship to religion. I think that Mockingbird is chiefly a novel about the mores of small Southern towns, and they are as much religion as anything else. And if you're not talking about the missionary society, you're missing some of the great comedy of that novel and some of the great social criticism of that novel. So it certainly informs my interest, and then I would like to think that the deepest way it informs this book is in, I called it democratic earlier, this idea that all lives are equally interesting or equally worthy of study. And I think another way of putting it is, it's the Imago Dei. It means that everyone in the world is created in the image of God, and their lives are interesting, no matter how far they've sinned or strayed. They're interesting. So I think in that kind of deep way, the way that this book tries to look empathetically at every character. You might think there's an obvious villain. I've told you there's basically a serial killer, and you might think there's an obvious hero, internationally renowned novelist, but I don't think it works that way. And I think that, it's for the Lutherans in the room. I was quoting Latin in the text. I'll give you simul justus et peccator, simultaneously saint and sinner, which I think is the greatest account of human anthropology ever offered. It's crazy that Luther offered it in the 16th century. It's so modern. It's so perceptive. And the kind of balance of those things in any individual, whether you're Tom Radney, advocating for civil rights, or Tom Radney profiteering off Black Death, or Harper Lee succeeding in teaching people something about their deeply held prejudices, or Harper Lee not able to articulate an even bolder vision of civil society, so you go quiet for decades, or Harper Lee who promises to write a book she never does, and never apologizes for, and never explains her failure, or the Reverend, bringing people to the altar, or leading them to their deaths. It just seems to me that every one of these characters is interesting because no one is a villain and no one is a hero. So it's a great question. I would love to talk about religion all day long. That's the other reason I loved writing this book. There's time and space and a kind of reverence in a lot of these towns. It was really a nice place for me to be. If you go to Alabama, it won't seem so unlike the Eastern Shore. Yes. This is a ringer. This is a very old friend of my family, so I'm hoping I've done the right thing and gone for the softball.
The most amazing thing about this book that you wrote is that you were able to amalgamate these two stories and properly, the story of Harper Lee, into a very readable, central thing. That's how you got the three parts to all come together.
Sure, that's very kind of you to say. Again, a bit of a jury's out on this one. Some people think it works and some people think it doesn't. So, feel free to let me know whether you think they come together at the end. A different way of writing this book would have been to kind of weave the stories together. And if you've read Eric Larson's Devil in the White City or David Grann's Lost City of Z, there are a lot of narrative nonfiction writers today who really weave stories together, and they bounce between two periods of time or two places or two characters. And I felt like these stories had to be distinct, and that the interpretive work would be for the reader to do. So I would give you the information you needed to put these characters in conversation with one another, but it would be too facile to sort of ping between them. Their lives were too different. Even though they were all born within a few years of one another in small southern towns, small Alabama towns, their lives were just radically shaped by very different structural forces. And I think there are a couple of straightforward illustrations of that. You may have noticed that the Reverend Maxwell had a distinguished Army career, and so did his lawyer, but when his lawyer came home to Alabama, he had experience litigating because he had served in the JAG Corps, and he went right to work as a lawyer. And the Reverend Maxwell, despite having served with distinction as well, came home and went to work for one of the cotton mills that had made the uniform he wore. And so leaving a segregated Army, he returned to the segregated South, and there was not as much opportunity, even for someone who had been as hardworking as he was. And of course, then there's Harper Lee, when I read to that passage about Marianne Pittman Allen, a woman whose life was mostly shaped by the decisions she had to make around her gender, around having children and being a good mother and raising a family, and who might well have been a Harper Lee, who might well have produced a novel as wonderful as To Kill a Mockingbird, but she had children early and remade her life in order to be a mother and ultimately a grandmother. So they're just so different. I felt like they needed to stand alone, but it means a lot of work for you. If you've read the book, you have to put it down and then think, what do these people have in common? Yes, ma'am. There is an audio. It's not me, thankfully. I can tell you there's nothing more controversial in the state of Alabama than a word like pecan, for instance. Or you guys, we all have our shibboleths if someone from the Western Shore says Talbot, and you cringe. I used to love it when I was at Oxford and I lived in England. People would say, "Where are you from in the United States?" And I would say, "Maryland," and they would say, "Oh, Maryland." And I was never offended. I just thought it was so beautiful and, a nod to our namesake. But yeah, I definitely didn't want to dodge the bullet of pronunciation. There's just a lot of tripwires there. So a professional narrator read it, but she's quite good, and you can get it online. And if you've never listened to the audiobooks for Mockingbird and Watchmen, I just want to say those are quite wonderful too. Harper Lee, kind of a big deal. Her books were read by Sissy Spacek and Reese Witherspoon, so they are incredible. In particular with Watchmen, if you didn't read it because you thought the prose was kind of substandard, or you got frustrated with it, Reese Witherspoon makes it even better by reading it. She's quite a good dramatic reader. So. Sure, one more. Do you guys want to fight it out? Who's got, the hardest question? I'm going to go with a librarian from Easton High School. So here we go. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Casey, but I'm going to take you on a slight tangent. So I've just come from the annual meeting of the American Library Association in Washington, D.C.
Fierce bunch librarians, don't cross
Yeah,
it.
we are. So I heard Jason Reynolds, a treasure in the world of literature for youth, tell us to become human librarians, to share our stories so that we can understand each other better. I heard Justice Sonia Sotomayor who told us to just ask, because we don't see everyone's disabilities. And where George Takei today reminded us that what our government did to him, his family, and thousands of others. So we're now in this time of fake news, where many people get their news from social media, and where many students take their first Google hit as gospel. Could you please speak to the growing national and, more importantly, local trend of reducing the number of school librarians to those people who are number of school librarians who are the people that are trained to teach information literacy and the love of reading?
Sure. I'm going to make a joke first because you all know me well enough to know it's what I'll do. This is why Harper Lee stopped talking. Now, I'm not Harper Lee. What will I say? Harper Lee was from, look, here's the truth. Harper Lee was from a very affluent family in Monroe County, Alabama. Truly. Her father was born working class, but made a tremendous amount of money as a lawyer, ran the local newspaper, ran the local radio station, sent his kids to public school, although they were the generation before integration. So now Monroe County has a lot of these segregation academies where people pulled their children out of the public schools in order to put them in private schools to avoid integration and the diversity that we now expect and demand of our public schools, not only of race, but socioeconomic status and ethnicity and orientation and all of these other wonderful ways in which we are different from one another. And so that's just to say, she could afford not to speak to the issues of her day. And it's quite interesting to look at a writer like Harper Lee, who was given such tremendous credit, deserved credit, for the innovation she gave to our country, a way to talk about racism. But she stopped speaking, and in some ways, a lot of people very close to her feel that part of that reticence was her novel's politics transcended her own, and that she stayed quiet because she was uncomfortable with the kind of moral witness she was asked to give in this country, and that by staying quiet, she could allow people to fill in. And gosh, I'm not one to stay quiet, and I just benefited too greatly from things like a high school librarian. I'm going to embarrass my high school teachers for 1 minute and say that I was an insufferable high school student. At one point, I demanded a independent study, which meant sitting in the library, getting to read great works of English literature, and then I wrote a paper at the end of every week that Odella Gay, who I think some of you know, a wonderful teacher in the schools here, would read and mark up. And I had parents who supported me in asking for the education I wanted. And not everyone does. Not everyone has advocates, not everyone has guardians, not everyone has people who can look out for their interests. And so I think that we as a community have to. And it's in funding our public libraries, it's in funding our public schools, it's in making sure that we have resource officers at these schools. And I just think we could talk till we were blue in the face about all the particular ways in which government can look out for the well-being of its citizens. And actually, I love Tom Ranney for the reason that he was insistent on this, even in a place as adversarial as the Deep South. But the long and the short of it is we just have to give generously. And we have to pay our taxes with joy. And look, I don't want to turn this into an event that it's not. But I will tell you, this county missed the opportunity to increase funding for its schools last year, and for its first responders, and for its sheriff's department. And a very modest increase in property taxes could have done that. And that is a stretch for some people, but it is not for a lot of others. And there are ways to fight for equality and justice and opportunity. And when you do, you make people like me. I'm the daughter of a mail carrier and a grocery store clerk, neither one of whom graduated from college. And I had well-funded public schools with advanced placement coursework and a well-stocked library and an attentive librarian, and you just can't do that without financial resources. So again, this is sort of a evangelical note to end on, and I'm happy to argue with you till I'm blue in the face about it, but golly, I love my taxes, and I pay more of them in Caroline County, where I live now, than you do in Talbot. If you do pay your taxes with joy, you also have the opportunity to just give to the Talbot County Schools through the Education Foundation, which is a tax-deductible donation. And if you know a teacher in the schools, you can do what I did and get to embarrass one of them by having your photograph taken, because if you give money in their honor, the schools will recognize you and you get to go into the classroom. So if you have a sister, it's a lot of fun, but you can just pick a teacher whose work you remember or admire or has made the world of difference to someone vulnerable in Talbot County. And that is a wonderful thing to do, and you can do it for $5 or you can do it for $50,000. They won't turn away your money.
So I want to thank Casey. She's done a wonderful job, and she is going to be here probably until 8. And we're going to have her up here in the corner signing books. So if you've brought a book with you or if you've purchased a book, please go ahead and go down the middle aisle and stand in line. We also have books that we're selling out in the hallway. So if you haven't purchased a book yet, you can certainly do that. And best of yet, we have a reception in the Frederick Douglass room. So if you're hungry, please stop by there. The Friends of the Talbot County Free Library have sponsored that. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We appreciate it.